Can you tell me how did you decide to promote cookies together?
Yeah, so it was in conjunction with having Dr. Schmetterner studying with us at UC Berkeley, which has been a great pleasure, and a recognition over time and in our work of these different areas that seem to be going off into different places and never really talking to each other, that seem to be in quite substantial tension one with the other. So one, the reproductive justice area, which was a movement that started with women of color, activists and scholars, expanding the reproductive rights platform to include the right to keep your children and the right to raise your children under good economic and social conditions. And so from that perspective, they're concerned with the use and abuse of the bodies of lower income women, of women of color, of immigrants, and of younger people, of women of lesser power within families and things, how they might be exploited to provide eggs and to provide the wombs to carry the babies of wealthy people, and transnational surrogacy was really looking at these problems of privileging the ways that wealthy people can easily move across borders to go and use the bodies to support their health and their reproduction. And these are often the bodies of poor people who cannot themselves migrate, or can only migrate as a condition of giving up bits of their bodies, these monstrous extractions. So transnational surrogacy had looked at those two ends of the spectrum of traveling in this thing we call reproductive tourism. And so we had, within transnational surrogacy, concerns for how do you travel safely, how do you have good ethical care, how do you have the right to access, for example, if you are gay and living in a country where gay people can't access reproductive technologies, your rights versus the rights of those people who are providing around the world, the lower class people around the world in a transnational hierarchy, providing body parts and services to the wealthy as a means of eking out some kind of bio-precarity and economic precarity. And then on the other hand, a kind of celebration of queer kinship around the idea of embracing normative family, having this pronatalist couple of decades recently, and moving away a bit from families we choose, which was the older anti-normative framing, which was the idea that we have kin by adoption, we have kin by not reproducing, a little bit like Kim Tolbear was talking about with making kin, not children. And so the question then seems sometimes to arise as, well, yes, these technologies have come to include queer reproduction, but at the same time as they make low-income women, migrants, and racialized women become these bodies in the service of the bodies of wealthy people. So this class, race, and migratory dynamics to it. So we wanted to put those people in the same room, some of whom tend to really be quite critical of the almost unregulated spread of these biomedical technologies, versus others who have at least found something to celebrate about the access to biogenetic family making. So bearing in mind that it's not as if you can just adopt, which also has all kinds of class, state surveillance, and racial dynamics and problems to it. So there are all kinds of issues that sometimes people will say, well, you should just adopt or whatever. So this was a beginning of saying, how can we put together those non-normative kinds of families that have actually been long celebrated and proliferated in communities of color, for example, and in migrant communities which have had extended families, and not just the neoliberal, capitalist, middle-class, white, nuclear family. How can we put those into the same arena as the non-normative family making around queer kinship, and begin to look at these questions of exploitation, of markets in life, next to the questions of expanded access to kinds of kinship for people who fall outside of the norm. Rather than seeing them as oppositions, how can we see them begin to talk from some points of connection and so that's what the conference today was about, was how can we bring those things into conversation. I was absolutely thrilled with the openings that we had today. I think there were a couple of problems that I've come away with. As Judith Stacy said at the end, we just began to open. We don't really have many strategies yet. But I think the two things that were most problematic to me at the end was, one is the way that Martin and I framed the thing around queer kinship, transnational surrogacy, and reproductive justice. We ended up, especially in the morning sessions, almost looking as if we were opposing reproductive justice and queer kinship. But the majority of people who are using surrogacy and reproductive technologies are straight, rich, heterosexual, white people, not queer families. And so in some way we were putting because I don't know whether the assumption is that, well, queer people should know better, or they're social justice activists, when did they become so neoconservative, or whatever. So I think there was kind of, in implying that somehow those were intrinsically in tension with one another, we managed to let off entirely the racial privilege and the sexual privilege of white heterosexual upper class elites in reproductive economy. So I think that was a problematic aspect of what came out of our framing. Another problem that I had of what I thought was a wonderful day was the idea of kind of looking back to an older era of queer kinship where we were more communitarian and everything was so nice, and now gay families aren't queer anymore, and there's nothing non-normative about them, and they're just kind of becoming hyper-normative, and the economic and racial hierarchies within the queer community are becoming so dominant, and again this kind of fluorescence of this moment of neoconservatism. And what I wanted to throw out into the mix was this idea of politics of respectability that's been developed particularly in queer of color literatures around these notions of the mandatory, or the kind of against a background of constant stratification, social structural stratification. How is affect organized? How do you express intimacies, affection, and how do you have the space to do that, to make family, to make love under state surveillance mechanisms and under the stratification of the markets in neoliberalism, and you do it queer families don't become hyper-normal, they become strategically normative in places, I would argue, at least most of them. Of course, there are still race issues, economic issues of stratification in the feminist movement, in the queer movements, just as there always were, that we need so badly still to keep working on. But in my experience, most queer families using these technologies are interacting with a non-optional politics of respectability and a strategic use of normative behaviors, of being perfect parents, probably because they are great parents, but also having to, and against the very real background of the susceptibility to having your children removed by the state. So that's kind of, so those were because we kind of left with those two places, I really wanted to trouble those two places where we ended up, but altogether it was a wonderful day. It was wonderful to have indigenous feminisms and kinship questions put on the same place with queer kinships, in the same place with reproductive justice and transnational bioeconomies.
Do you have any numbers of how many children have born in the United States from surrogate mothers?
I'm afraid I don't have those numbers offhand, but there are well over 5 million ART babies in the world today. So there are, not from surrogates, but born through these technologies. In some countries, in some communities, it's more than 1% of the population. So this is the new normal.